I've been wanting to talk about super communicators for months, and I'm so glad we are finally able to make this happen.
Thanks for having me. This is a real treat.
Communication is something that people feel a tremendous amount of anxiety around. They feel like, I don't know how to talk to my family and friends. The entire communication discourse feels fraught with landmines, like you can go wrong at any moment. And I'm wondering, first of all, are some people just born better at it?
No,
No, nobody's born better at it.
nobody's born better or worse at communication. It's entirely a learned set of skills. And in fact, if you talk to people who are great communicators and you ask them, have you always been a great communicator? They'll say something like, no, in high school, I had trouble making friends. People who are good at communication are just people who think a little bit more about communication. And it's really that thinking that makes us recognize what we need to do to get better at it. So no, there's no one who's born with the gift of the gab. There's just people who grew up in environments where these skills were habituated a little bit earlier than others. But we can all learn them at any time.
What are some of the characteristics of people who are good communicators?
Yeah.
What commonalities do they have? What are the skills they have learned?
To explain that, I should tell a little story about how I started researching super communicators, which is that I fell into this bad pattern with my wife, where I would come home from work and I would start complaining about my day. My boss doesn't appreciate me, or my coworkers don't realize what a genius I am. And my wife very practically would offer me some good advice. She would say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better? And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get even more upset, right? And I would tell her, like, you're not supporting me enough. You're not outraged on my behalf. She would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. I think this is a pretty familiar pattern to anyone who's been in a relationship, right? And the thing is that I knew that this would happen again and again and again. I kept walking into the same trap. And so I went to researchers and I asked them, like, why does this happen? What's going on? And they said, well, we're really glad that you came by because we're actually living through this golden age of understanding communication for really the first time. Because of advances in neural imaging and data collection, we can sort of see what happens inside people's brains as they have conversations with each other. And one of the things that we've noticed is that we tend to think about a discussion as being about one thing, right? We're talking about my day or where to go on vacation or next year's budget. But actually, they said, if you look at someone's brain, what you'll see is that during that discussion, there's multiple kinds of conversations that are occurring. And oftentimes these conversations, they fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical conversations, which are about solving problems or making plans together. There's emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize and I want you to relate. And then there's social conversations, which is about how you and I relate to each other in society and the identities that are important to us. And they said, what we've discovered is that if two people are having different kinds of conversations at the same time, even though both of them are equally legitimate conversations, it's actually impossible for them to hear each other fully. It's really hard for them to connect. And this has given rise to what's known as the matching principle in psychology, which says successful communication requires having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. And that, of course, explains why my wife and I were having this problem, right? I was having an emotional conversation. She was having a practical conversation. And it was only once we got aligned that we could fully hear each other. And then we could move from practical to social to emotional back to practical together. But we'll be able to really hear what the other person is saying. So that's the first skill. Paying attention to what kind of conversation is happening. Is this practical? Is this emotional? Is this social? And then matching the other person or inviting them to match you.
It's a great point that you're making that when somebody is telling you calm down or take your boss out to lunch or why don't you just try writing him an email or whatever, you're having different conversations. And that disconnect is very uncomfortable for people.
Yeah, it's very uncomfortable. It also feels like you can't connect with each other. And so there's another technique and another skill that we can use to figure out what kind of conversation is happening. And that's to ask questions. But not all questions are created equal, right? There's some questions that are known within psychology as deep questions. And a deep question is something that asks about my values or my beliefs or my experiences and invites me to tell someone what's going on inside my head. And that can sound kind of intimidating, right? To ask a deep question, but it's as simple as if you meet someone who's, for instance, a doctor, instead of saying, what hospital do you work at? Asking them, what made you decide to go to medical school? That second question where I'm asking you how you made a decision, what your values are, what experiences you've had, that's going to yield a much deeper answer And at that point, I'm going to know what kind of mindset you're in, and whether you're looking for a practical conversation or an emotional conversation or a social conversation. So that's the second skill, is learning to ask questions, particularly deep questions. And in doing so, to listen for clues as to what's on the person's mind.
I've discovered in having political conversations with people that there are some questions that are disarming and sort of allow people to open up. And there are some questions that seem to put people on the defense.
I think in general, questions that signal that you're genuinely curious are better than questions that feel like an argument posed as a question. What matters much more is to be genuinely curious, to genuinely want to understand why they believe that thing. And this actually brings us to the third skill that is really important that super communicators do really well, which is proving that we're listening to the other person. That oftentimes simply asking a question isn't enough. Even listening to them isn't enough. Because oftentimes when it comes to things like politics, there's this sneaking suspicion in the back of our mind that this person I'm talking to, they appear to be listening, but actually they're just waiting their turn to speak.
Right, right.
And so one of the important things we can do is we can prove that we're listening. And there's actually a technique for this known as looping for understanding. And in looping for understanding has 3 steps. The first step is that you ask a question, preferably a deep question, right? Tell me about why do you like that candidate so much? And then when the person has finished answering the question, repeat back in your own words what you heard them say. And the goal here is not mimicry, right? The goal here is to prove to them that you're paying attention, and maybe even to prove to them that you've been processing this. So those are the first 2 steps. Ask a question, repeat back what you heard the person say. And then number 3, and this is the step that I always forget, is ask if you got it right. Because when we ask if we got it right, what we're actually doing is we're asking for permission to acknowledge that we were listening. And one of the things that we know about our human psychology is that if I acknowledge that you were listening to me, you become much more likely to listen in return. So when I ask you, am I getting that right? What I'm actually doing is I'm asking you for permission to acknowledge that I was listening, which puts you in a position where you're more likely to listen to me.
Yeah, it's this principle that maybe people didn't know was supported by research, but this principle of seek first to understand before seeking to be understood.